The screen opens in darkness. Waves crash against a restless Atlantic, the sails of 3 fragile ships straining under a moonless sky. The creak of wood, the whisper of wind, the pounding of the ocean. It feels less like a voyage and more like a prayer. Out there, beyond the horizon, lies nothing certain, only faith, ambition, and fear. To some, this man at the helm was a hero, a visionary who dared to chase a dream when others clung to the safety of shore. To others, he was a destroyer, the harbinger of conquest, enslavement, and devastation. But to all, Christopher Columbus was something undeniable, the man who changed the world. Born in obscurity, driven by obsession, he convinced kings and queens to gamble on the impossible, that the world could be reached not by traveling east, but west. In 1492, he set out not with armies, but with sails. And yet, the ripples of that journey would reshape continents, topple civilizations, and ignite the birth of what we now call the modern world. But who was Columbus, really? A visionary who expanded the limits of human imagination? A flawed man blinded by greed and glory? Or something in between? A mirror of human ambition itself, with all its brilliance and all its brutality? This is not just the story of a man crossing the ocean. It is the story of how one voyage opened a door that could never be closed, a door that carried both discovery and destruction. And so, our journey begins with the man who crossed the horizon. The story of Christopher Columbus begins far from royal courts or great fleets, on the narrow streets of Genoa, Italy, in the year 1451. Genoa was a bustling seaport, its docks crowded with merchants, fishermen, and ships bound for distant horizons. For young Columbus, the sea was not just a backdrop, it was a calling. From an early age, he showed little interest in ordinary pursuits. Instead, his eyes were fixed on maps, stars, and the restless waters that carried men to worlds unknown. His father was a modest wool weaver, but Columbus dreamed beyond the loom. He apprenticed with merchants, sailed as a teenager, and soon found himself immersed in the art of navigation, learning to read the stars, sketch coastlines, and chart courses through perilous waters. The 15th century was an age of explorers, and Columbus was captivated by their tales. Stories of Marco Polo's travels to Asia, of spices and silk, of gold and kingdoms richer than imagination. All of it ignited a fire inside him. He became obsessed with a single idea, that one could reach Asia, not by sailing east around Africa, as the Portuguese had begun to do, but by sailing west, across the unknown Atlantic. It was a radical vision. At the time, most believed the journey would be too long, the seas too wide, the risks too great. Columbus studied maps, consulted ancient scholars, and convinced himself the Earth was smaller than most thought. If he was right, Asia was only weeks away by sea. If he was wrong, the ocean would swallow him whole. Driven by faith in his calculations, and in himself, Columbus set out to find support. He took his idea first to Portugal, where the great seafaring nation already commanded trade routes around Africa. But the Portuguese rejected him, dismissing his plans as foolish and dangerous. England, too, turned him away, unconvinced that the gamble was worth the risk. Again and again, doors closed in his face, but Columbus was nothing if not relentless. For nearly a decade, he pursued patrons, rewriting proposals, seeking audiences with kings, dukes, and scholars. His persistence bordered on obsession. He was mocked, doubted, ignored, but he refused to let go of his dream. Finally, his path led him to Spain. There, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile listened, hesitated, and then, after years of pressure and persuasion, gave him their blessing. They promised ships, men, and resources. To Columbus, it was not merely funding, it was destiny. From the crowded streets of Genoa to the royal halls of Spain, The wool weaver's son had transformed himself into the captain of an audacious gamble. To cross an ocean no European had dared to cross before, in search of a world they only imagined. One man's impossible dream was about to set the world on fire. Spain, 1492. The year that would echo through history. After years of pleading and rejection, Christopher Columbus finally received the backing he had sought. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, monarchs of a newly unified Spain, agreed to his audacious plan. But their support did not come cheaply. The contract they signed, the capitulations of Santa Fe, was extraordinary. If Columbus succeeded, he would be made Admiral of the Ocean Sea, governor of all lands he discovered, and entitled to a share of the riches, gold, spices, and treasures that might flow from these new territories. For a man of humble Genoese origins, it was the promise of unimaginable power. To Spain's rulers, it was a gamble that could bring glory and wealth, or nothing at all. On August 3, 1492, 3 ships set sail from the port of Palos, the Niña de Pinta and the Santa Maria, modest vessels by modern eyes, yet vessels that would carry the weight of destiny. The crews were a mix of sailors, adventurers, and prisoners promised pardon if they survived the journey. Many boarded reluctantly, fearful of the vast unknown stretching westward. For them, this voyage was not discovery. It was madness. Life aboard was harsh. The men endured cramped quarters, salted meat and hard biscuits for food, and water that spoiled in wooden casks. The air stank of sweat, tar, and rot. Day after day, the horizon offered nothing but endless blue. At night, the stars glittered above, the only guides in a void of uncertainty. Fear grew with each passing week. Rumors of sea monsters, of ships falling off the edge of the world, of a voyage without end, haunted the crew. By September, whispers of mutiny spread. Columbus promised them land and riches. He reassured them with confidence he may not have fully felt. At times he lied about the distance traveled, hoping to soothe their fears. He prayed that his gamble, that Asia lay just beyond the horizon, was not wrong. And then, on October 12, 1492, just before dawn, a cry rang out from the Pinta. "Tierra! Tierra! Land!" The crew erupted in relief and jubilation. After more than 2 months at sea, they had sighted an island. Columbus named it San Salvador. To him, it was the edge of Asia, the gateway to the riches of the Indies. In truth, it was part of a vast continent unknown to Europeans, a world that would soon be forever altered. On the shores of the Bahamas, Columbus planted the flag of Spain, claiming the land in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. The indigenous Taino people watched curiously, unaware that this moment would mark the beginning of centuries of conquest, colonization, and catastrophe. But for Columbus and his men, this was triumph. Their voyage had not ended in failure or mutiny, but in landfall, land that promised wealth, glory, and salvation. The world had shifted. A barrier had been crossed. But few knew, on that quiet island morning, just how profoundly everything was about to change. The morning light of October 12, 1492, revealed not just land, but people. On the beaches of San Salvador, Columbus and his men stepped ashore to meet the Taino, the indigenous inhabitants of the islands. The Taino greeted the strangers with curiosity rather than fear. They wore little clothing, adorned themselves with feathers and shells, and carried simple tools and spears tipped with stone. To the Spaniards, they seemed both exotic and vulnerable. To the Taino, the newcomers were a mystery, men clad in shining metal, bearing strange weapons, riding massive wooden vessels that dwarfed their canoes. At first, the encounters were marked by warmth. The Taino offered gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and food. They welcomed the strangers with generosity, sharing what little they had. Columbus noted their kindness in his journal, writing that they were a people so full of love and without greed. But behind Columbus's words was calculation. What fascinated him most was not their hospitality, but the gold ornaments glinting in their ears and noses. Small nuggets and flakes, worn casually as decoration, ignited a fire in his imagination. If such gold was commonplace here, he reasoned, there must be entire kingdoms of wealth waiting to be claimed. The Taíno marveled at Spanish swords and ships. The Spaniards marveled at their simplicity and mistook it for weakness. Exchanges of gifts and smiles hid a growing imbalance. For Columbus, these were not equals, but subjects. He wrote that with just a handful of men, he could subjugate them all. The first meeting seemed peaceful, even idyllic, two worlds greeting one another with gestures of friendship. But beneath the surface lay seeds of conquest. The Spaniards saw resources. The Taíno saw visitors. One side sought harmony. The other sought dominion. What began with handshakes would soon turn to shackles. For Columbus, the New World was never just about discovery. It was about ambition, gold, God, and glory. From the moment he stepped ashore, his eyes searched not for allies, but for wealth. Gold ornaments worn casually by the Taíno convinced him he was on the edge of unimaginable riches. And so, Columbus made a vow. He would bring back to Spain not only the promise of treasure, but souls for conversion, and honor for his own name. He wasted no time securing a foothold. On the island of Hispaniola, Columbus ordered the construction of a settlement, La Navidad, built from the remains of the wrecked flagship, the Santa Maria. He left behind a garrison of men, tasked with gathering gold and spreading the authority of Spain. But harmony did not last. The Taíno, who had first welcomed the strangers, soon discovered the darker side of their guests. Columbus's men demanded food, women, and labor. When the Taíno resisted, violence followed. What began as exchanges turned to raids. What began as friendship turned to fear. Columbus recorded his intentions with chilling clarity. They are fit to be ordered about and made to work. To him, the Taíno were not partners in exploration, but a workforce to be bent to European will. Some were captured and shipped back to Spain as proof of conquest. Others were enslaved in their own homeland, forced to mine for gold that was far more scarce than Columbus had promised. Still, his reports to the Spanish crown painted a picture of abundance. He spoke of rivers lined with gold, of lands ripe for Christian conversion, of limitless opportunity. Ferdinand and Isabella, hungry for wealth and eager to expand Christendom, rewarded him with titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor of the Indies. But the titles hid a truth. Columbus's dream of discovery had already begun to corrode into domination. The promise of the Indies was now measured in ounces of gold, in baptisms, in the expansion of empire. For the Taíno, this dream was a nightmare. For Spain, it was the beginning of a new age of conquest. The horizon that had once symbolized wonder now symbolized ambition. The voyage that had once been a leap of faith was becoming a machine of control. The dream of discovery had become the machinery of conquest. Columbus's first journey had shaken the world, but it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, he would launch 3 more voyages, each one more desperate, more chaotic, and more revealing of the man behind the myth. In 1493, Columbus returned to the Caribbean at the head of a much larger fleet, 17 ships carrying settlers, priests, and soldiers. No longer was it a voyage of discovery. It was colonization. Towns were built, crops planted, and missions established. But the fragile balance with the Taíno crumbled almost immediately. The Spanish demanded tribute in gold, and when it could not be given, they demanded bodies for labor. The island that had once been paradise now became a place of chains. By 1498, on his 3rd voyage, Columbus sailed further south. He reached the coast of South America, marveling at the mouth of the Orinoco River, convinced he had found the edge of Eden itself. But paradise was slipping further away. Reports of cruelty under his governorship began to spread. Settlers complained of harsh rules, natives spoke of brutality, and Spain's crown began to doubt their chosen admiral. On his fourth and final voyage in 1502, Columbus skirted the shores of Central America, searching desperately for a passage to Asia that did not exist. He battled hurricanes, shipwreck, and disease, his body weakened, his dreams crumbling. The once proud admiral was no longer charting new worlds. He was clinging to the wreckage of his own vision. But the greatest storm was waiting at home. Accusations of tyranny, of corruption, of mismanagement grew louder with every passing year. His harsh rule in Hispaniola led even Spanish settlers to rebel against him. In 1500, royal officials stripped Columbus of his governorship. He was arrested, bound in chains, and shipped back to Spain like a criminal. The irony was staggering. The man who had crossed an ocean, who had been promised wealth and titles beyond imagination, now sat in darkness, wrists bruised from iron shackles. His discoveries had remade the map of the world, but they had also destroyed his reputation. Though Ferdinand and Isabella eventually freed him, they never restored his titles. Columbus would live out his last years still dreaming of Asia, still insisting he had found the gateway to another world, still blind to the consequences of what he had unleashed. The admiral of the ocean sea was now a prisoner, of his crown, of his critics, and most of all, of his own ambition. By the dawn of the 16th century, Christopher Columbus was no longer the celebrated admiral who had once been paraded through Spain as the man who opened the gates of paradise. He was older now, sickly, his body broken by decades at sea and years of conflict. Arthritis gnawed at his joints, fevers racked his body, and his once commanding presence had faded into a figure of frailty. The crown that had once rewarded him with titles and riches now regarded him with suspicion. Though Ferdinand and Isabella allowed him freedom after his humiliating return in chains, they never restored his governorship, never gave him back the power and prestige he believed were his divine right. To Columbus it was betrayal. To Spain it was justice. And yet, to the end, he refused to abandon his dream. In his writings, Columbus remained convinced that he had found not a new world, but the edges of Asia. To him, the islands and coasts he had explored were fragments of the Orient, gateways to the riches of Cathay and Cipangu, described by Marco Polo. The truth, that he had stumbled upon continents unknown to Europe, was one he never accepted. In 1506, in the Spanish city of Valladolid, Christopher Columbus died at the age of 55. He passed quietly, without grandeur, his final years marked more by bitterness than by glory. Few mourned him outside of his family. The world that had once cheered his return from the ocean's horizon had already begun to move on. His titles remained stripped, his honors diminished, his legacy uncertain. And yet, even in death, Columbus left behind ripples that would shape centuries. His voyages had altered the course of history, bridging two worlds that had once been separate. The exchange of peoples, goods, ideas, and devastation that followed would remake civilizations on both sides of the Atlantic. But Columbus himself never saw it. He left this world with maps unfinished, with dreams unfulfilled, with truths misunderstood. He was a man who had set out to find Asia, and instead set fire to the future. The admiral, the prisoner, the dreamer, Christopher Columbus. He left not with triumph, but with questions. Not with gold, but with shadows. And in the silence of his final days, one truth remained. He died believing he had reached Asia. And in that, his greatest dream and his greatest mistake remained eternal. He left this world with maps unfinished and dreams misunderstood. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he believed he was opening a door to Asia. What he actually opened was something far greater and far darker. His voyages created a bridge between two worlds that had, for thousands of years, evolved in complete isolation. That bridge would come to be known as the Columbian Exchange. Across the Atlantic, new currents of life began to flow. From the Americas came foods that would forever change diets: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, chili peppers. These crops fed Europe, Africa, and Asia, fueling population growth and transforming cuisines. From Europe and Africa came wheat, rice, horses, cattle, pigs, and technology that reshaped agriculture, transportation, and even warfare in the New World. But along with food and livestock came something else: disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, epidemics unleashed upon populations who had no immunity. Entire civilizations of indigenous peoples were shattered within generations. In some places, 9 out of every 10 lives were lost. What began as Columbus's dream of trade became, for millions, a nightmare of death and displacement. The dual legacy of Columbus is impossible to ignore. On one side, he connected continents, ignited an age of global exchange, and altered the course of human history. On the other, his voyages began a chain of conquest, colonization, and exploitation that devastated indigenous cultures across the Americas. To his Spanish patrons, he was a pioneer. To the people whose lands he entered, he was the beginning of an ending. And so, centuries later, Columbus remains one of history's most contested figures. In the United States, his name became a symbol of discovery, celebrated in statues, monuments, and the holiday known as Columbus Day. For generations, schoolchildren were taught to honor the man who sailed the ocean blue. But in recent decades, voices have risen to challenge that story. For many indigenous communities, Columbus is not a hero, but the harbinger of oppression. Cities and states across America now replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, a recognition of the civilizations that thrived long before his ships arrived, and a reminder of the lives lost after. Columbus's legacy is not simple. It is not one of pure heroism, nor of pure villainy. It is a legacy of vision and violence, of connection and conquest, of progress and pain. He was not the first European to reach the Americas, nor did he truly understand what he had found. But he set into motion a chain of events that no one could ever reverse. Christopher Columbus changed the world forever. But at what cost? The camera lingers on the horizon. Endless ocean. Waves breaking against the bow of wooden ships. Slowly, the sails of the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria fade, their silhouettes swallowed by the sea. In their place, glowing lines spread across a modern world map. Routes of trade, migration, conquest, and exchange radiating outward from the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus remains a symbol, a man who dared to cross the unknown, and in doing so, changed everything. But history is never simple. His voyages brought together two halves of the world for the first time, creating connections that reshaped humanity. Yet those same voyages unleashed devastation, disease, and destruction upon the very lands he claimed to discover. Columbus was not the first to dream of crossing oceans, nor the last to chase glory, but his name stands as both a beacon of ambition and a warning of consequence. Because history's greatest stories are not just about what was gained. They are also about what was lost. Stay curious, stay questioning, and if you seek more untold histories, subscribe and join us on this journey into the shadows of the past.